Okay, this is approximately where we had left off with yesterday, and we briefly began that video that had dealt with what we call pygmy animals. And our, well, say, I don't want to say thought, but our concept that we really wanted to explain yesterday was when we talk about this history or theory of evolution, the idea that animals will always become larger is not always going to be the case. Okay, I do believe that's a fairly common concept that we had discussed there, that you may have discussed when you were in elementary. And in certain cases, it's not wrong. We had talked about the idea that some animals will continue to grow larger because the size of an animal is certainly going to have an effect on what it can prey upon, and then what is also going to prey upon it as in an animal. So again, this is where we left off. So we begin with development of what we consider these new organisms, whether they continue to get smaller or they may continue to get larger. Okay, so at its root, as you can see, evolution is development of new species from pre-existing ones. In certain cases, they may diverge from a common ancestor, or and what that means is they become further and further apart as the demands of the animal will change to fit its environment. And there's many different cases that would drive an animal to look the way it does, and of course predation and whether it may become geographically separated, or whether what it is that's preying upon that animal. Because if you don't have very good traits to pass on, well then that's when that gene pool would then become extinct then. Okay? So again, evolution is development of these new organisms from pre-existing ones. Okay? And again, the idea is to pass that trait that's successful from one generation then to the next. And one of the things that you'll see in this video, I think they'll get to caribou or deer perhaps that had migrated from the mainland. I want to say whether it's Iceland or Scotland or somewhere in that vicinity. And what happens is the demands would change on these animals on this island as opposed to that of the mainland. Since there is less snow, I believe, these animals would probably tire when having to move around from one place to another in large amounts of snow, and depending upon what's preying upon those animals. So what we see here, with natural selection, yes, there can be what we consider overpopulation. So those individuals that are considered to be the most healthiest then would pass on those traits. Nature's selecting them to do that. Okay? And for those of you who go on to take zoology, we spend an extended amount of time talking about this process as opposed to just the short amount of time that we place in this part of the curriculum. Okay? And again, here's the idea of size. There's always going to be this constant struggle for food and different types of habitats then as well. So this is why size is going to be such an important aspect of these animals' lives. Who's preying upon them, and what can they actually take in for their diet? Forward. So you can see here, when we're talking about this genetic variation, okay, that can be found on page 300, and in a couple of minutes we'll take a moment to read through that passage in the textbook then. And again, we'll want you to cue in on watching this video is the caribou or reindeer of that island called Svalbard. And what the author goes on to talk about is, and I think it's essentially true, is that strange things do happen to animals when they reach islands, because their predation would be different, and who's preying upon them would also be different. So to make better uses of their resources, these reindeer then become smaller. More animals can um, manage the island better without taking all of its food source away, so animals become smaller. Now, an example of a lizard, for instance, that of on the island of Komodo, since there's nothing to prey upon that animal, it actually became larger. So just because an animal is forced to live on an island doesn't necessarily mean it's going to become smaller. In this case, it can also become larger. And once these animals have successful traits, like it says in that third bullet, this could be anything from longer fur if there's any type of climate change due to a type of genetic variation, or longer or shorter legs. And then, should that trait be successful, it will then be passed from the parent then to the offspring. So I think that went 2 slides ahead. And I think you'd agree that top bullet is probably the most important. Organisms with the best adaptations are going to be the most likely to survive then. And I think that'd be hard to argue with that type of a statement. And next week we will continue with this when we get to where it's talking about fitness. But for the time being, I'll give you a minute or so to write that down, all the way down to fitness, and then we want to take a look at page 300. Okay, so what we see here on page 300, when you look at figure 15-4, it's talking about the diagram represents the process of natural selection explained by Charles Darwin as a mechanism of evolution. Okay, so what we see here, it's a four-step diagram, and it looks like what we're talking about with those reindeer of Svalbard. In step one, it's talking about overpopulation. It says each species produces more individuals than can survive to maturity, and sometimes that's probably quite common in a lot of species, that there's always going to be more organisms or offspring produced than what can survive. Moving on to step two, and this process would probably take thousands of years. When we're talking about evolution, again, it's not going to be a process that takes place in tens of years to hundreds of years. We're more so looking at more so thousands of years. In this case, a type of genetic variation in step two. The individuals of a population may differ in traits such as size, color, strength, speed, ability to find food, or resistance to certain types of diseases. So if there's a type of bacterial infection, um, I believe it was maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago here in the Midwest, there's many deer, I think, that were falling victim to something called a blue tongue, where that was just the common name for it, and the deer that came down with this bacterial infection, if I'm not mistaken, uh, would happen in the back of their mouth, and it's not so much that their tongue was forming blue. That's maybe that's why it's called that, but they would not be able to swallow water or take in water, and that was perhaps what had killed many deer in that population. So they may succumb to different types of diseases, like it says in step 2 with genetic variation. In step 3, it's talking about struggle to survive. Individuals must compete with each other for limited resources. Also, some species will be harmed by predation, disease, or unfavorable conditions. So there again, it can be something, the size of the animal can certainly determine whether it's going to be successful in being able to pass on those traits to its offspring. Then in step 4, we have differential reproduction. Individuals that have certain traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than individuals that lack those traits. Over time, again, this is a process that takes thousands of years, those traits become more frequent in the population. And the more frequent that they become, the more successful that species then would be. And that's what they're trying to illustrate in those 4 steps in that diagram in figure 15-4 on page 300. So again, when we come back next week, we'll be talking about the fitness aspect within natural selection. And next week we'll talk about evolution in action and how different types of shapes, like that of hands that you can see on page 305, would repeat itself in different types of species. And then finally we'll talk about this evolution in action then as well. And that deals with different types of case studies, dealing with that of a lizard on page 308. And we'll also start a segment, it's called Before the Dinosaurs, that, what I want to say, maybe explains or gives rise to the idea of how or why animals look the way they do today. But there again, that is next week. We'll have your vocab due, let's see here, not Wednesday the 8th. We'll shoot for the 9th, Thursday. That would be a week from yesterday. Your vocab will then be due for this chapter. We'll also have a vocab quiz on that day as well. So again, we'll be watching a video today, and keep an eye out for that example of the reindeer of Svalbard. We will catch up to you next time.